Any deep form of spirituality, any kind of esoteric form of spirituality that's useful in the sense of awakening, will really sort of, in its own way, take dead aim at the ego structure. And when the ego structure starts to give way, starts to have sort of cracks within it, this is often when you experience a kind of dark night, although I did like how Robin talked about this of, I feel as though my ego is being systematically stripped away layer by layer. The torment and agony are exquisite. It's a really interesting thing to say. The torment and agony are exquisite. An exquisite kind of torment and an exquisite kind of agony. And the reason for that is, whenever we really see, whenever some part of the structure of ego falls away, there can be a kind of, difficulty with it. It can be challenging. It's only challenging, however, to the exact extent to which we hold on. And that to that extent, it's difficult. But there's also an exquisite element in it, because as any piece of the ego falls away, you feel a kind of buoyancy, a kind of a sense of a lot more room in your consciousness, a sense of a greater sense of freedom, you might say. And this is this kind of paradox of seeing through the illusory structures of ego can be, the paradox of seeing through things can be at times wonderful, at times it can be quite challenging and difficult to realize that so much of what we held on to, so much of what we held as to be true and real and necessary, when we really have the wherewithal to be very quiet with it, very still, this is what allows us to actually look at it with great clarity, a great kind of precision. And when we really start to see into the nature of the ego with a great clarity and a great kind of precision, the ego starts to have sort of almost like fractures in it. It starts to loosen up. And in fact, pieces of it can fall away at any time, or we can transcend it altogether at any time. But as the questioner says, as they said, really the ultimate answer to this question, how to go through this transition, is to not resist it. Because of the thing that resists the falling away of ego is ego. All the resisting, all the even the concern about it, is really a kind of underlying grasping at what's familiar. And spiritual inquiry and deep meditation, will really show us directly what's real and what's not real. And initially, what we really need to see, so we don't really need, in one sense, initially it's far more important to see what's not real, because that's what loosens the whole structure up. But there's a great difference between hearing about what's not real, hearing about our sort of false construction of self and ego. It's one thing to hear about it or even understand the unreality of it. You can even accept it or believe in the unreality to it. It's something quite different to have it start to actually fall away, to start falling away and falling away and falling away. Because what's falling away is everything that you took to be real and everything that you oriented your life around. You oriented intellectually or conceptually, you oriented emotionally, and even energetically in terms of a kind of knot or a kind of constriction. There's a kind of orienting around the egoic constriction as well, so that the constriction becomes normalized. If you experience a kind of contraction or constriction for long enough, at a certain point you stop being aware of the contractedness of it, of the feeling tone of its contraction. You may experience that very profoundly at moments of difficulty. But the baseline, underlying just sense of contraction, even when the ego is feeling very good, even when the ego feels like everything's going its way, the very existence of ego is itself a knot of contraction, In the mind, the ego is made up of mental construct, thoughts, belief, opinion, all the intellectual construct that our kind of life or our self or orbits around, is how the ego at the level of mind knows itself. It's what it orients around. This is exactly why when someone's beliefs get challenged, that they often get quite resistant or sometimes angry if you challenge their belief, because what you're really doing is you're challenging the very thing that egoic contraction orbits around. It's the way it knows itself, in other words. It orients itself around these sort of mental structures. And of course, there's also emotional structures as well, a structure of feeling. The ego in the heart is a kind of defensiveness. And sometimes that defensiveness is felt very overtly as a closed heart, as a contraction. Sometimes it can show up almost as like a diffuse pain of contraction in the chest in general. This sort of emotional contractedness. And you can feel it. When you move amongst the world, you move with different people. You can watch the ego in certain situations around certain people. The ego contraction will lessen and it will relax, and you'll know that it's lessening and you'll know it's relaxing because you'll feel a profounder sense of connectedness, or maybe just a sense of well-being. Or perhaps even a sense of a kind of deep involvement. What I mean by that is a kind of intimacy, But on the level of the emotional body, again, the ego sort of orbits around a kind of heart contraction, which is a protection of the emotional body. Right? Protectiveness, however, at the level of how that protectiveness occurs, the form it takes, is really just a contraction. Protectiveness is a simple emotional state of contraction. And that state of contraction can and does become so habitual that for the most part you can go through great periods of time without even feeling it. You can not even feel it because it's become so habitual. And so whatever is habitual, we tend to eventually experience as something that's just normal. It just becomes part of the normal atmosphere. And then in a way, you're not even really you don't notice the contraction until you're challenged. Until someone challenges you, and then you can feel the constriction of the heart, the protectiveness, perhaps the arising of heat and more vibrant energy would be the arising of kind of anger when you feel challenged, or it can go the opposite into kind of depression, which is also a kind of contraction. It's a kind of pulling away from what is, because the emotional body can assume that what is its problem, is the very difficulty it's having. This is why there's a paradox. It's a whole heart of spiritual seeking or yearning, You know, there's a paradox where we can be drawn towards truth, drawn towards reality, and simultaneously be pushing that very reality away, pushing that truth away, or hiding from it. You know, it's sort of, I want it, but I don't want it. Or I love you and I don't love you. So there's sort of this contradictory aspect or energy that goes with the spiritual pursuit itself, where you feel very drawn, but also hesitant, or sometimes very drawn and downright afraid. Or you can feel an opening and feel at the same time a kind of disorientation, you know. In one sense, we really should expect to be disoriented for a while. You know, if we have the very structures, mind structures and emotional structures, that we orient around unconsciously, that have become you might say, our personal style, the way we move through life. When these start to fall away, these are the very structures that our awareness has oriented itself around. This is what it knows. It's conformed itself, you might say, moment to moment, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And that's what the system knows. So when we start to have enough insight to where we start to see the emptiness or the non-existence, the non-reality of these mental structures, these emotional structures, it's at once freeing, but often simultaneously, at the very least, you go through a phase where it's quite disorienting. Right? Because your conscious awareness no longer has the structures that it oriented its whole life around.